Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by writer and literary agent Paige Towers to discuss her most recent release, What They Stole, a familicide rooted in intercountry adoption. This episode does cover some themes that may be disturbing to some listeners, including child abuse and murder. With that, let's get right into the conversation. So, welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am joined today by writer Paige Towers to speak about her most recent release, What They Stole, a familicide rooted in intercountry adoption. So, Paige, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on, first off. But yes, I'm Paige Towers. I'm a writer and literary journalist living in Bellingham, Washington, although I'm originally from Iowa City, Iowa. And I am currently mostly momming. I have a young child, but I do freelance here and there when I can.
Nice. So when it comes to What They Stole, where did you originally get the idea to write a book like this? Where did inspiration come from?
So again, I'm originally from Iowa City. And when I was a senior at the University of Iowa in 2008, there was this horrific event that happened where a man, Stephen Suepple, murdered his wife and 4 adopted children before ultimately taking his own life. As you can imagine, it was an incredibly shocking event for the whole community, for the Midwest at large. And I was really traumatized by the event, even though I didn't know the family personally, but it's a small community and I had like 100 different little social connections to them and would see them around town. And about 10 years after the event, it occurred to me that I had never gone back and researched it. And so I just woke up one morning and started Googling. And what I found was not only information about the case, but I kind of got, I think through Reddit or something, I kind of got into these adoptee threads and found that the history of intercountry adoption from Korea is a lot more complicated than I'd ever known. And so very quickly I became obsessed and just couldn't read enough. And so I very quickly saw the Suepple tragedy in my hometown as kind of a window into this larger, traumatic, complex history of adoption from South Korea.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you had such a personal connection to this tragic event. So to get to end the tragic murder of a family and the suicide, we kind of have to look first right at the end of the Korean War, when after the U.S. troops had left Korea and there were many babies left in the wake of that, and maybe the feelings towards these children in Korea to get to where we are. If we want to go into that a little bit.
Sure. So I think what a lot of people don't realize is that intercountry adoption was a very rare practice before World War II. So the only time it was really occurring was somebody working abroad, like an ambassador, and like a married couple abroad would adopt a child in the country that they were stationed in. And even then there were federal regulations that a couple was only allowed to adopt 2 children maximum, unless that meant splitting up multiple siblings. Then you have World War II, and you have millions of displaced families and children. You have countries that are in total free fall crisis. And the regulations in those countries are incredibly lax because there's no government support in place. All of a sudden, you have these American GIs that are stationed abroad that start walking into orphanages overrun with children and start adopting children without much screening and as in little time as like 1 month. This went on for a few years. We're talking about like Germany and Greece and Italy. And very quickly, those countries realized this is a crisis. We have to increase regulations and increase social supports. And so, boom, that's done. You can no longer adopt from those countries as an American. The Korean War happens in 1850 to 1953. And as you say, there are American GIs stationed abroad, and they are fathering multiracial children born to Korean women. This is a very new thing for the world. What ends up happening is GIs are suddenly not only fathering Korean children, but they are on the ground interacting with Korean children every day. And it becomes this kind of new American benevolence. There's this term called military humanitarianism, where the soldiers started funding and building orphanages, and they're providing charity in the form of food and clothes. And all of this is reported by the US media, and US citizens at home are watching this. And so while adoption out of South Korea started with the US military, and you have actual soldiers, a lot of them single men, bringing home Korean children, it very quickly drew the attention of Americans, not only through US media, but through missionaries telling these stories. So the Holts, who are the crux of my story, become very interested in this crisis of multiracial children in a very destitute country. But in general, there becomes this mass demand to bring home these multiracial children, especially children that are white Korean children that have been whitened by their American fathers.
So you mentioned Holt. I think we probably need to give them a little bit of backstory, who they are, how they ended up getting involved in adoption, and then we can go from there with them.
Great. So Harry and Bertha Holt are first cousins from the Midwest. Bertha actually went to the University of Iowa. They moved to Oregon during the Great Depression and very quickly became wealthy through logging and developing their own sawmills. They had no experience, no history in child welfare, but they were born again, deeply conservative evangelical Christians. One night they attended an event given by an organization called World Vision that was supporting children in South Korea. So they, through their church, they developed this own idea that they would go to South Korea and adopt 8 multiracial children. This was incredibly radical at the time and not actually legal, but they did manage it because a senator from Oregon helped them push through a special act for them called the Holt Bill. So they brought home 8 children in 1955, and this was a huge media event covered by Life, covered by all the national newspapers. I think the family experienced this major revelation of this is our calling. This is what God wants us to do. And so very quickly it turns from we've brought home 8 children to we're going to start an adoption agency. As I document in What They Stole, the Holts were very anti-federal government. They did not believe in regulations or whatever they called red tape. And so they did not follow the guidelines set by other adoption agencies and social workers. They instead just kind of forged their own path and developed a very rudimentary adoption application for Americans, which meant that they did not they didn't do background checks, they didn't screen their adoptive families, they didn't do home studies. Instead, the main factor for adoptive families was that they needed to be born-again Christians.
Reading through when Harry went over to Korea and was looking for these 8 children to adopt, and the letters that he writes and the way that he describes these children, even the way that Bertha describes them, it seems almost detached. Like they are very okay with, like, oh, like with Paul. We got to Paul 3 because Paul 1 and Paul 2 unfortunately didn't make it. But when writing about it, it was very blasé, very, we'll just move on to the next one. And I think that, feeling of detachment had a big impact on how they treated their adoption agency over the next, until recently.
I completely agree. And this is something that's supported by the interviews that I did with surviving Holt family members, their biological children and their adopted children. And I think it has something to do with the religion that they were raised in. They were part of this very small conservative sect called the Plymouth Brethren in Iowa. And then again, they later became born-again Christians. But they very much believed that time on earth was extremely temporary, and they didn't treat death as an emotional event. It was just God chose your time and now you're moving on. And they also felt very strongly that Jesus was coming back to the earth at any moment and that the world was going to end. And they had kind of this very fatalist view of life, which, as you said, it doesn't transfer into, arguably, into ethical adoption work. So not only were there countless deaths under their watch, under their care, they later developed some of those original ideas into the adoption agency's policy. So as you said, children continued to have their identity switch where one child dies. We just, instead of redoing the paperwork, we'll just swap paperwork and give it to a new child. I think people don't realize this happened en masse until the 2000s. Yeah, that obviously is disturbing, but it was just the norm. And it also became the norm for other adoption agencies in the region too.
One of the things you had mentioned was like orphaning by paper. So just completely fraudulently making up stuff for a child to be adoptable. So forging the information, kidnapping children from parents, or not being honest with their intentions when they were approaching people with children that they wanted to adopt out.
Right.
Lots of fraud and dishonesty around this adoption for quite some time. It wasn't like it was like for a little bit of time, which still wouldn't make it okay. But it was something that continued on for quite some time.
For decades. Right. Yeah. This started in the 1950s. And again, this is what my book is critiquing, is the system that when we incentivize adoption and finding and taking children and separating families, that evidence-based, it very quickly leads to corruption. It leads to people kidnapping children or coercing mothers into relinquishing their children, and often for a bribe or a fee. And adoption paperwork, as you say, was forged because it made the children adoptable and able to be sent overseas as quickly as possible. So if we erase their identity, if we change the details of their past lives, then no parent, no biological family member is going to be able to track them down, and vice versa.
Yes. I want to touch a little bit on, his name is escaping me, the man who was in charge of Korea when Holt originally went over there, and his feelings towards these biracial children, and how he kind of aided Holt in his work to adopt these children out in this inter-country adoption.
Are you talking about Bob Pierce, or was it a Holt agency employee?
No, it was the Prime Minister of South Korea.
Oh, like Syngman Rhee.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, that's a great point, is that the Holts had incredible governmental support in South Korea. So you have, on the US side, you kind of have this, you have Eisenhower administration, deeply anti-communist and fear-mongering over the Red Scare, and they see multiracial children as kind of a shame on the US, and are also wanting to establish America as this benevolent hegemony. And so you have kind of some very lax policies on the US side. And then on the South Korean side, you have a government that is actively working with and meeting with the Holts in order to break down any legal barriers to get these children out of the country. So at first, it's multiracial children, which challenge this notion of a pure race in South Korea. And it soon, in less than a year's time, becomes impoverished Korean children, especially children born to single mothers. Not only is that challenging a social status, but it also brings money into South Korea from the West, and it relieves the South Korean government of having to provide any social services. So they are saving money and putting more money into the military. There's a perceived massive threat from North Korea reinvading. And it just kind of became government social policy, was that instead of providing services to keep mothers and children together, we will instead separate families and send them for a fee to the West.
Yeah. And with these adoptions, so Holt was doing proxy adoptions,
right?
Which over time became something that wasn't like the US started to catch on and they were like, this is actually not something that we want to be allowed anymore. But, they still found some workarounds for that.
Sure. So proxy adoption, I don't have like the definition in front of me, but basically it's when an overseas agent adopts a child in a foreign country on behalf of the parents. And then the child is flown under that person's care and then legally is readopted in the US by their adoptive parents. And so in this way, people were adopting sight unseen again until the 2000s. So parents were not flying to Korea to meet children beforehand and establish a relationship and see if it's a good fit, but instead they were picking up children from the airport. So this was really a radical thing, and proxy adoption was very limited before the Holts came in.
I think that kind of leads to the Suepple family and how they were able to adopt their 4 children.
So the Suepple family in Iowa City, they adopted their 4 children, all adoption by proxy through the Holt organization. So they never traveled to Korea. They adopted sight unseen and picked them up at a Midwestern airport. They adopted their first child in 1998 and their last child in 2006. So in pretty quick succession. So Steve and Cheryl Suepple were a professional suburban couple in Iowa City. Steve was the vice president of the local bank, and Cheryl was a teacher, elementary teacher, until she left to raise her kids. And they were just a very well-known, very connected, community-oriented couple. And they argue in the book that there, in general, is this very interesting idea about adoption that still exists, that it is an act of rescue. It's a benevolent act. There's this white saviorism idea behind adoption. There's also a lot of racial identity issues. There's transracial adoptees coming from overseas that are assimilated into white culture. But the Suepples were adopting under this idea that adoption was a benevolent act and a great way to build a family. But what happened was that Steve ended up embezzling and money laundering from his employer over $500,000. And after this information came to light and later his charges, as you can imagine, his life very much unraveled. And so what my book does is explores that timeline as well. It's what's going on with the Holt agency that has decided to send a family in a financial crisis. They've decided to send them 4 children. And there's also an issue of their youngest child. Her adoption is potentially going to be finalized while Steve is facing these federal crime charges and facing a long prison sentence. And so the goal was not to condemn adoptive families. I don't want to vilify anybody, but I wanted to look at the system and how things like this happen and not to treat this just as an isolated event, because as my book shows, unfortunately, traumatic adoptions like this are not isolated events.
Over time, it has gotten better, but those initial, like in the 50s and the 60s, those first adoptions that the whole agency even facilitated, there were a noticeable amount of adoptions that ended in the death of children or severe abuse. And as we said earlier, the Holt family and their adoption agency, they didn't do any background check or anything. Like, you filled out an index card. If you wanted a baby, you paid the fee and you got yourself a baby or a toddler.
Right. Yes. There was a ton of neglect happening within the agency. So you have babies and young children who are very sick and dying, arguably from medical neglect in the Holt's child centers in South Korea. And a big reason this is happening is because the Holts, due to their religion and their values, they did not believe in modern medicine. And so they severely understaffed their child centers with nurses and doctors until at one point they have like one nurse treating like 100 babies at a time. And so it's not known, because these records are private, it's not known how many children died in their care in South Korea, but we can probably arguably say hundreds. then you have this issue of, instead of sending the children over to America for adoption on commercial airlines, which was the standard, and it was no more than 8 children on the plane at a time, Harry Holt wanted to really, what's the word I'm looking for? To quicken this process. And so he was chartering out-of-date old Korean warplanes, removing the seats and putting in baby boxes so you could store like 100 children at a time. And this is a term they called baby lifts. Unfortunately, these children were not allowed to convalesce in South Korea, with medical care or with a foster family. Some of them were just a couple of weeks old and maybe weighed as little as 5 pounds, which is horrifying. A lot of them were suffering from tuberculosis. Most of them had pneumonia, diarrhea, other ailments that made them incredibly frail. And as many as 2 or 3 children were dying on these baby lifts over. And then, of course, as you said, they're arriving. And while some of these families might have been decent and stable and loving, many others were not. And a lot of children suffered deep, deep abuse. Children were trafficked. Children were abandoned. Children ran away and disappeared forever. And unfortunately, children were murdered.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the 8 adopted Holt children themselves? We kind of talked about them a little bit at the beginning, and then we moved on a little bit to something different, but maybe talk about them and their lived experience as part of this family that, facilitated all of these adoptions.
So again, Harry Holt brought home 8 multiracial children from South Korea in 1955. He had gone around the country to different orphanages selecting these children, and the family wasn't screened. They had 6 biological children at home, but what the public was reading about these adoptions was very different than what was happening in private, as what I discovered during my interviews and research for this book. I don't want to speak on behalf of all 8 of these children. Some of them declined to have an interview with me. A couple of them had positive things to say about their adoptions, and it's obviously not remotely my role to speak to that. But I can speak to those people that I interviewed for this story, that what was happening in the media was not happening at home. So not only does Harry go back to Korea and is out of the picture and is no longer parenting, but he also relies on their biological children to fly to Korea and help him launch the agency there and to help in the child centers. So very quickly, this idea that like the whole family would be raising these 8 children, you're really left with just Bertha on her own and a couple of their 2 youngest daughters. Bertha is also working for the agency and working around the clock. She's on the domestic side, processing their rudimentary applications. She's contacting politicians to make sure that they continue to be able to bring home children on baby lifts. And so the children are sort of raised by community members, by church members, by their siblings. It just was not the picture that was given to the press. And as I detail in What They Stole, those children didn't, I'm trying to say this in a way that is careful, but they did not all thrive. One did not survive his childhood. Some were placed unofficially in foster homes. One later died by suicide. And so that was really kind of a big goal for me was to reconcile this happy, sentimental U.S. media mainstream story with the reality of what's happening behind closed doors. And that, of course, turned out to be true, not only for a lot of adoptive families, but for the Holt family themselves.
Yeah. So, in this conversation, we've talked a lot about, intercountry adoption and how, especially with the Holt family organization, how there wasn't so much background checks or looking into these families. And even just recently, as 2000s with the Suepple family, the sight unseen adoptions.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything present day with these intercountry adoptions that has changed? Is this something that's still continuing? Is this something that you are able to speak on at all?
So intercountry adoption has shifted dramatically. It's become much more highly regulated, in part due to a Hague Convention Act in the early 2000s. And why this is happening is because there are activists all over the world that are working to prevent the crimes associated with intercountry adoption that we've already touched on, kidnappings and bribery and child trafficking and abuse. And so sending countries very much start to crack down on the industry. Some of them dispel these private adoption agencies altogether and say, we're done with this. And in the US, there has been less regulation, less reconciling with the past. It really largely been sending countries that have had to protect themselves from these Western nations who are, we're coming in and taking children back to this huge population of people who would like to adopt a child. While intercountry adoption has decreased significantly and the regulations have gone up significantly, there are still issues. The biggest fear that I would argue is that adoption seems to increase in times of crisis. We can point to Haiti during the earthquake, where suddenly adoption became very unregulated for a short period, where children were being flown out without having looked for relatives, that sort of thing. And you also have the Ukraine war, where Russia has been going in and taking Ukrainian children without consent from their biological families, without paperwork, and taking them back to Russia and North Korea. So the fear is what happens when the world continues to experience crisis, not only with war, but with climate migration, refugees, immigrant detention. Over and over, it just seems that in moments of crisis, that large, powerful countries take advantage of that moment to separate families and to take children and adopt them into what is labeled as loving, most often white, stable Christian families.
Yeah, I think one thing that we might have going for us in the 21st century is that it can't be as secretive as it was maybe in the 50s and the 60s. There are more people that are more aware of things. So I think that will, as we progress forward, help assist in trying to limit as much as possible this adoption Wild West during crisis. I think as we move into the future a little bit more, I think that might be a little bit more, there's more watchful eyes, I think, now that are more aware versus back in the 50s and the 60s and even up until the 2000s when it was something that was really at the forefront of many people's minds.
I agree. And that is hopeful. And I know that there are a lot of adoptees and adoptive activists that are nervous, especially as there's been dismantling of women's rights. And I think that people are just simply saying we need to stay aware is the main argument. We need to make sure that nobody takes advantage of a fragile moment to take vulnerable children.
Very nicely said. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on today before we go?
Sure. Thank you. Well, first off, I'm so grateful that you've read the book and had me on. I really appreciate being on here and talking about the book. I want to reiterate that the goal of this book is not to condemn adoptive families, not to condemn adoptive parents. My goal was to analyze the system and go back to its infancy and understand how we got here. And again, to challenge this notion that adoption is this happy, charitable act of rescue. And the white saviorism ideals that kind of lurk behind that, or maybe sort of like sound the alarm behind that. And just to ask people to slow down and listen to adopted people and the things they've suffered through and the changes that they're actively working for.
Awesome. So where can we find your book?
You can, the weird thing, it's out of stock currently on Amazon and bookshop.org, which I've been told is a good thing.
That is a good thing.
It is currently sold out and they're waiting on a shipment for a week, but you can still order it on there. Or you can order it through your local bookstore, which would be absolutely lovely thing to do.
Yes, I will definitely include a link to I like to do the bookshop.org one in the description of the episode. And is there anywhere people can find you?
PaigeTowers.com. And I have a contact form on there. I love it when people write me emails, and I do try to reply to as many as possible.
Awesome. So as someone who has read the book, and I enjoyed reading it and how Paige has laid it out, it's a very approachable read, something that while the content might be a little difficult to read, the way that it's written is approachable. And I think that you guys will enjoy listening to it. Thank you, Paige, for coming on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again to Paige for coming on the show. I have included a link in the description to the book if you are interested in reading through this story. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.